What up everyone, Shark here, welcome back to the channel. What I've got for you all today is an overview of aircraft and Broken Arrow. We're going to start by going through the armory and talking through the different munitions types and how they're employed. Then I'm going to show you some builds of various aircraft that you can copy and use in your games right now to have effect. And then we're going to talk aircraft micro, how to get your aircraft on target, annihilate the enemy, and get them back so you can use them again 4 minutes later. As always, timestamps in the description below. Hit me up in the comments to let me know what you missed. And without further ado, let's get to it. So I think the most important thing to do up front before we get into specific aircraft builds and payloads is we get into the munitions, and I show you kind of the different categories of munitions and the considerations for use so that you understand when you see the planes and the bombs available to you, you can choose them appropriately for the role that you need that airplane to perform. At the end of the day, it's all about understanding the role of the platform and having it available to fulfill that role when you need it. So the easiest way to do this is to come into the armory. And I have a couple of examples here, but trying to figure out what the weapon does, if you just hover over the munition, it'll tell you what it is. So in this case, this is an air-to-air missile. In this case, this is a smart bomb. Whether or not it has a range, that's also really important. Whether or not it's laser designated, the kinds of targets it can engage. Right, and then obviously penetration, but against ground targets is definitely important. And then the damage profile, and in some cases, the accuracy. Most missiles are just going to say 100%, and then bombs are going to have kind of a CEP accuracy figure. I want to start by going over the munitions that will automatically fire as long as your aircraft is in position and has a target within range. And that really means the anti-air munitions with a couple other exceptions. So starting with anti-air, you've essentially got 4 categories. You've got long range, medium range semi-active, and then short range or anti-helicopter munitions. Now, I'm going to have some examples here on the screen, and then I will actually put up a list as we're going through this of all the weapons in the game that fit this category. But the way you can tell here that this is a long range missile, other than the fact that it says air-to-air missile when you hover over it, is this 9,000 meter range. That's the longest range for an air-to-air missile you're going to see in the game. If you go into the info tab, you'll also see it has the longest minimum range at 2,000 meters. What's interesting about both these munitions, it applies to the Raptor and the Su-57, is that they can be fired max range from low altitude as well. So that's important to note when it comes to how you use these. Because of the high minimum range, the ability to fire from low altitude, the best way to employ these is to keep your fighter near the rear of the battle space and allow it to engage aircraft at maximum range. This increases its own survivability and really doesn't have any significant impact on your chances of hitting the enemy fighter. They can still do evasive actions, etc. It's worth noting, 19 damage versus 16 damage. Most airplanes can survive one direct hit and will be down to just a chunk of health. The penetration only matters slightly because there are some airplanes with armor, usually the ground attack ones like the A-10, the Su-25. But in this case, it's not really a big deal considering that this is going to outclass the armor on those airplanes anyway. Next, when we get into medium range, one thing I want to highlight. So you've got the AMRAAM, you've got the R-77, and they have only 7,000 meters of range. The damage profile on the US side is identical to the JADAM. On the Russian side is actually worse, lower penetration, lower damage. But there is one specific thing I wanted to highlight, and that is the maximum speed of these medium range terminal guidance missiles is actually higher. The AMRAAM and the R-77 are about 33% faster than their long range and short range counterparts. So this is also very helpful. Really the role for these, if you've got an air superiority fighter built, you've got some long range missiles and you've got some medium range missiles, use the long range missiles to kick off the engagement. And then if you need to pursue these medium range, this AMRAAM, this R-77 are still there. And because they're so much faster, they actually have the opportunity to catch a fighter that is on Afterburner trying to flee the scene. So that's really the role there. You'll see in many cases, fighters will have automatically, you can't even customize them away, either a handful of these AMRAAM R-77 equivalent or a handful of the Sidewinder R-73 equivalent for self-defense. And so something to keep in mind, they are available to you on a lot of platforms, even if you don't specifically try to customize for them. Now, there's like a subcategory of medium-range air-to-air missiles where the guidance is semi-active. So in this case, the AIM-7 Sparrow is the best example. And what that really means is that your aircraft has to continue to spot for the missile, or an aircraft has to continue to spot for the missile in order for it to hit its target. So in a lot of cases with the AMRAAM, with the long-range missiles, you can take the shot and then break off to keep your own aircraft safe. With the Sparrow, that's less of an option. The advantage for the Sparrow and the other semi-active missiles typically is they have higher penetration and a higher damage rate. Although in this case, it really doesn't. So if I were you, I wouldn't use the Sparrow. I think the risk it creates to your own aircraft, the shorter range, and the fact that it is not high enough to one-shot any of these main aircraft mean that it is not ideal. All right, and then the final category of these missiles are your short-range anti-air. And really what you're looking for is specifically the ability to target helicopters. So on the US side, it's the Sidewinder. On the Russian side, it is the R-73 and then the R-60. You'll see they have lower penetration and lower damage. They are fire and forget, which means they'll just kind of take off on their own as you go through. But it is worth noting, they don't do a ton of damage. I think they're useful because they're normally on your fighters. And they'll be equipped anyway, regardless of customization options, where you can keep them on. So it allows your fighters to occupy kind of a multi-role. But what I would want to discourage players from doing, I don't think it's a good idea to have a fighter come in purely with the idea that it's going to knock down helicopters for you. You're still going to need 2 hits per helicopter, and the anti-air environment is probably going to be so thick that fighters are not an efficient anti-helicopter platform. Instead, if you have a fighter on the field doing something else, whether it's anti-air, whether it's anti-seed or anti-radiation, and then it has the Sidewinders and can contribute to working through your helicopter problem, that's probably the best way to approach this. The gun is also useful for this, but it really requires you to close, and again, normally will expose your aircraft to some really dangerous threat environments. Quick example here of how to employ air-to-air missiles. You'll see sometimes I direct F-22 to attack a specific target. Other times when a target enters into range, it'll automatically launch the air-to-air missile.
New bearing set. New course set. Changing course. Proceeding as frag. Going hot. Flight plan updated. New course set.
The other category of auto-fire munitions are your anti-radiation missiles. On the US side, this is the AGM-88 HARM. On the Russian side, it's the KH-31. These are used to target enemy radars when you're conducting SEAD missions, suppression of enemy air defenses. You can see the stats are pretty similar. The US one has 8,000 meter range as opposed to 7,000 for the KH-31. But really what's important, it's not about altitude. It's just about whether or not the aircraft is in the position and can see the radar. When you're at low altitude, you can't see the radar. You have to get closer before you can actually see the radar, but it's also allows you to get closer before the radar can see you. So you can use low altitude to approach, pop your aircraft up. The pilot will fire the HARMs, the anti-radiation missiles, if they can see the radar, and then you can dip back and get away. One thing to note, on the US side, there are specific aircraft that can load the AGM-88 HARMs, so they're normally kind of your seed aircraft. Like the F-16 CJ, the F-35 can do it. On the Russian side, a lot of the Russian jets can carry 1 or 2 of these anti-radiation missiles. So it's worth noting that you can have kind of a multi-role approach to SEAD. To conduct SEAD, when you have an idea of where the radar is, bring in a SEAD aircraft and fly it safely towards where the suspected enemy radar is. When it spots the enemy radar, you'll see the HARM will aim and launch. If the radar is not visible, it may be off, or you may have to come up to a higher altitude to get better coverage. So now what I want to talk about are the air-to-ground munitions, and there is an absolute ton of variety here. There are some that will kind of fire on their own, so I wanted to bring them up first. These are the air-to-ground munitions that have laser designation available. There are essentially 3 ways to fire the Maverick, right? You can The easiest way to do it is you can have someone laser designate for it and then be flying near it. And as soon as your aircraft sees a laser designation, it will fire the Maverick. The KH-38 on the Russian side functions the same way. And you can see these weapons are tank killers. Super high penetration, super high damage, will usually one-shot an enemy vehicle.
New heading set. Roger, flying there. Flying to coordinate.
Now, air-to-ground missiles without laser designation always need to be fired from the airplane's high altitude. So there are two ways to basically do this. One is to just have the plane fly in, right-click on the target, or give it a strafing run option, in which case it'll expend those missiles on whatever it can see. To perform a strafing run, make sure your airplane has some space. Hit K, and then set up by clicking and dragging where you want the strafing run to take place.
Panther ready.
Note the plane can do some degree of self-spotting. It'll launch its Mavericks and use its gun.
Flying to coordinates.
Otherwise, you can keep your airplane at low altitude and then give it an attack or a strafing run order, and it'll continue to use those missiles. However, the airplane will pop up to high altitude. So when you do this, it is important to actually give the little AI pilot, whatever, give the airplane enough time to actually line up the run that you're asking for and pop up. Because the worst possible thing that can happen is you give the strafing run order a little too close to a turn, the airplane pops up, realizes it can't get the munition off because it doesn't have sufficient aim time, and then circles around for another pass, the entire time exposed to anti-aircraft fire. That's a really easy way to lose your very expensive air-to-ground aircraft. The next category I want to talk about are your low drag munitions. So sometimes the game will call these free fall bombs. Sometimes the game will call them smart bombs. The way you can tell is that there's no range identified with the munition. And if it's a low drag, free fall, or smart bomb, your airplane has to be at high altitude to make the drop. The way you're going to do this is essentially set up a bombing run. If there's laser designation, you can use bombing run or precision strike for these munitions.
Strike complete. Direct hits confirmed. Joint strike.
But the best way to kind of tell if you have the right munition for the task at hand is based on the penetration, the damage, and the radius. In some cases, it's worth noting when you have like cluster munitions, you have this little icon here, and this means that the damage is spread evenly over the entire area of effect. This also applies, in this case, the Rock Guy is a high drag munition, which I'm about to talk about anyway. But when you have something like, not the Stormbreaker, but the JSOW, that also applies a cluster effect. So it is considered a smart bomb. You have to be at high altitude to launch it. You can laser designate for it. It'll coast in and then apply that cluster munition effect. 7 damage, 400 penetration in a 50-meter radius. Okay, now let's talk about high drag bombs. Right? And again, if you hover over the munition, it'll tell you it's high drag. And the best thing about high drag bombs is they can be dropped at low altitude. This increases the survivability of your aircraft significantly, especially if you use terrain masking, decoys, and afterburner appropriately. So in this case, it's a top armor damage munition. So the 200 penetration pretty much guarantees not only are you going to penetrate, but even with the explosive armor roll here, you're going to get max damage for every one of these munitions. And then the cluster, the damage area is spread evenly over this area of effect, right? So in this case, with this build here, this F-16 comes in on the bombing run, stays low. The Mavericks aren't going to fire if you're low. In fact, if you try to tell it to do a strafing run without laser designation for the Mavericks, it's actually going to pop up. So this build can be a little bit difficult to micro. We'll talk about that later. But if you're at low altitude and you tell it to do a run with the Rock Guys, it'll stay at low altitude. Same thing over here with the Fab 500 SHL. For the Su-34, it's a high drag bomb. In this case, no cluster effect, but still pretty substantial damage. So this is kind of an area effect bomb. To perform a bombing run with high drag bombs, you use the P or the L key, and it's just like with the strafing run, you click and drag. With high drag bombs, the airplane will conduct the bombing run at low altitude.
Airstrike complete. Pressing out. Turning to new head.
Now we'll roll up by talking about what I consider your fire support munitions, right? Obviously, there are nukes in this game. It's one of the best parts is seeing a tactical nuke come in. It does increase the price of the aircraft significantly, and this is something we'll talk about later. But as you can see, you get 1 munition, the tactical nuke, 2,000 penetration, 666 super metal damage on that. Insane blast radius. It says 50 meters, but it seems to spread out. This thing is nuts, and it's great if you find enemy troop concentration to just wipe it out. But that 1,000 resource point cost is a little bit of a risk, so only use it when it's worth it. One kind of counterpoint to that example, it's a free fall bomb as well, just like the nuke is. But in this case, you get 2 at a 500 point cost, 300 penetration, 175 damage, and massive AoE. So something to keep in mind, this might be cheaper. Now, you can always get, in this case, a nuclear cruise missile with the Tu-160. That's also really nasty, although it can be intercepted. But worth noting, if you're going to go for the bombing run anyway, these Fab 9000s are a really nice kind of alternative to the traditional nuke. Now, what you normally see these fire support platforms used for, whether it's the B2, the B-52, is actually the cruise missile setup. So both of these can carry a number of cruise missiles. I think the B-52 can carry the most. It's an insane number. But when well microed, these can be devastating, right? So you keep the aircraft way in the back, and then as you identify targets, you use the precision strike queue to just ripple off these missiles. 16 for the B2, 12 for the Tu-160. They have very high penetration, very high damage, very, in this case, extremely high AoE. This is the cruise missile spam that can really wreck games if your opponent does not have the right anti-air defenses, the intercept capability like the CRAM, the PIVADs, etc., that you need to kind of counter this. The last use is as a conventional bomber fire support in this case. So you've got LJ dams, you've got just standard 2,000-pound bombs, JSOWs here. These are, smart bomb cluster munitions. On the Russian side, same thing. Cluster munitions, smart bombs, just big, massive dumb bombs, and then thermobarics as well. These lower penetration, but they get top attack score, so that penetration will still count. Super high damage. This is when we start talking about role. What do you need this bomber to do, and what do you think the anti-air environment is going to look like? To use cruise missiles, bring your bomber or launcher onto the battlefield, hit P the number of times for the number of missiles you'd like to launch, and then left click for every spot you want the missiles to strike. You'll watch the missiles line up and strike. Note these missiles can also receive laser designation. Although sometimes apparently the laser designation just goes nuts. Now, as we transition into specific builds, there's one thing that I really want to highlight. A lot about the aircraft needs to be about the specific role and the cost, right? You might be tempting to load down the aircraft with a bunch of different munitions, but that increases, 1, the cost it takes to get it on the field, and then 2, the destruction value and points that you give to your opponents if they knock it out of the sky. I really want to emphasize this. So the B2 itself is probably only, I think, 200 points. Most of the points that are associated with it are in the actual munition value. However, it doesn't matter if you drop the bomb or not. If the airplane is shot down, you give that entire unit score to your opponent in terms of destruction value. So let's say you bring the B2 on for 1,000 points because it's got the nuke. You would think like, okay, if it gets shot down with the nuke inside, they get 1,000 points. But even if you successfully drop the nuke, if the B2 is shot down after the fact, you still give your opponent 1,000 points. Which leads me to my next point. Everything about airplanes in this game is about trading points. Until you get really good with evasion and usage of your airplane platforms, it is a good idea to assume that your airplane is going to get shot down and not return. So in that case, one of the best things you can do is make sure that the target is worth losing the cost of your airplane. right? If you bring in an F-15C that only has a couple missiles on it, costs like 300 points, and you shoot down a 500 point Su-57, 100% worth it. That's a 200 point delta in your favor. That's a 1.66 KD from that engagement right there. Ideally, you can keep your airplanes alive, and I'll talk about how to do that later, but that is the thing that has to be going through your mind when you're determining how you want to build and then use your aircraft. All right, now we're going to get into specific builds, and everything that I have here for you is about the role that the aircraft is designed to play within your build. This is where team play comes into it, because depending on your specialization, you may not have the option to have an ideal air-to-ground platform or a seed platform or a fire support platform. But knowing kind of what you have in your deck is really important. The other thing is, it is tempting to get into multi-role, and once you have the micro for it and you understand how to use the airplanes, you can do that really effectively, but it comes with a lot of risk. So I would recommend you focus on identifying airplanes that can do specific things for you early, getting used to using them, and then adjusting your deck as we move on. Let's start with an air dominance or air superiority build. And here what I have, these are the two best fighters in the game for air superiority. On the US side, it's F-22 Raptor, right? And in this build, I have both bays with two of the AIM-260 JADAMs. So 4 of those total missiles, plus it'll always carry 2 AMRAAMs and 2 Sidewinders. The biggest advantage of this plane, it has 12,000 meter optical range, which drops down to 4,000 at low altitude, but its stealth is set at 1.75. This means if you're facing off against an Su-57, the Raptor will detect the Su-57 at 9,000 meters. The Su-57 won't detect the Raptor until it's at 6,000 meters, about 6,800, which means that you're already within AMRAAM range for the Raptor by the time you can see it. That's a huge advantage for the Raptor. In this build, it is very expensive, but this is something that, like, what I love to do is use this during the air attacks. I bring this onto the field, I keep it in the back, I keep it at low altitude. As the enemy's aircraft kind of approach, whether it's looking for our aircraft, looking for helicopters, whatever, I let the JADAMs engage as other aircraft spot for me, close if necessary with the AMRAAM, and then send it back to base to recoup the cost and make sure it's on short cooldown. This normally results in really effective trades early. You can also do this with the PACFA. You just need to make sure you have other aircraft spotting for you, because you still have this 9,000 meter range. So keeping it at low altitude, right, it's going to hurt its own individual visibility, but if your other teammates are throwing aircraft forward, this can effectively trade with American kind of multi-role mid-range fighters. One option for the Su-57 that I really like is the ability to add 2 of these anti-radiation missiles. So you keep the long-range capability, you keep the short-range capability that it comes with by default, but now you have 2 harms with it. And this allows you to use it, for the air attacks phase, not quite as effective, but this allows you to go into the late game and bring it on to use that multi-role. This is one of the cases where I think the multi-role is really helpful, because if you spot enemy radars, now you're actively putting pressure on them with anti-radiation missiles, and you can still challenge the US fighters at max range with the R-37. All right, these 2 aircraft are what I consider absolute overkill anti-air builds. So for the F-15EX, you have 16 AMRAAMs, right? So keep in mind, no stealth, right? So it doesn't get the range sight reduction that the F-22 does. And the 7,000 meter range means that you have to basically trade fairly with the Russian aircraft. 16 of them is a lot, though. And so this can be really valuable if you just need to salvo a ton of anti-air munitions, especially during the anti-air phase, and especially if you're not playing a soft specialization for USF. The other piece here is you get to carry 2 harms. You can also swap these out for an even more obscene 4 additional AMRAAMs or some fuel tanks. But again, just like with the Su-57 previously, I like being able to combine the harms with the AMRAAMs. It gives you ability to kind of counter early radar, especially during the air attacks. One thing people will do is bring Patriots or S-300s into the rear, immediately set their radar on. This is a great way to counter them early, is with a build like this. Keep in mind though, super expensive. That's a lot of points to give up to your opponent if you let it die, so be very cautious with how you use this airplane. The Su-35, this is also kind of similar. You can do a couple different things with this. It's got access to the R-37s, can carry 4 of them. You can also carry additional R-77s. My recommendation here, if you can ever add ECM pods, do it, right? That 20% basically means guaranteed 20% miss rate on any incoming missiles. Also, in this case, I am building this out for anti-air. I'm not worried about helicopters. So for me, the R-73s really aren't worth it. If I wanted to set it up to go after helicopters, I would totally switch the build around. I'd add R-73s with the ECM. Then I'd come up here and say, I actually don't want these R-37s or even these R-27s. These are semi-active. I would consider looking at this build. These are kind of dogfighting builds here, R-77s, R-73s, right? Swap these out for medium range anti-air, because you are already saying here with this build, if you really want to dive into R-73s for anti-helicopter, you're going to close a range. So having more of these R-77s is more valuable than the R-37s with their minimum 2,000 meter range. All right, for seed aircraft, I have a couple of different examples for you. First one, the EA-6B Prowler comes with 4 harms. It's a relatively slow aircraft, relatively limited optical range at high altitude, same 4,000 at low altitude, but it can carry 4 harms, which can actually help it get past some of the initial interception defenses. So if you keep it at low altitude, keep it safe, spot the radars with it, this can be really, really effective. On the Russian side, similarly, you've got the Su-25. In this case, it can equip 2 of the anti-radiation missiles. I also have it with the cluster bombs, so you can think about it in one of 2 ways. It's either multi-role, you can come after tanks with the cluster bombs and use the harms to kind of keep the airplane safe on the way in, or you can redirect the cluster bombs onto a mass of anti-aircraft vehicles if you're trying to deal with that sort of thing, like a bunch of SHORADs. On the wingtips, ECM pods, because I feel like anytime you get the option, you should build that out. For 2 more seed aircraft builds here, the Su-34, very similar to the Su-25. You have 2 of the anti-radiation missile builds, and here you've got 10 cluster bombs. This is really, again, designed to attack a tank column with some ability to defend itself with anti-radiation missiles. The Su-34 has a million different options here that you can swap in. I've chosen to go for the ECM pods, but you can also add ECM pods with R-73s or R-77s, so it can also defend itself against aircraft. On the F-35 side here, there are 2 options. One, you can just put a harm in either bay, right? And there's nothing wrong with this. Having 2 shots at a target is really helpful. But one thing that has been recommended to me is swapping one of these for the JSM cruise missile. So it requires a little bit more micro, but you can come in, use the harm to potentially identify the enemy's radar, and then follow up with a precision strike from a cruise missile. Again, you're going to try to have to get through the enemy's air defenses, but it gives you a little bit more optionality. If later in the game you actually don't need all of that seed firepower and you need some fire support, that cruise missile will help you. All right, now as we get into more specific air-to-ground builds, I want to highlight kind of the difference here in the way I approach the US aircraft versus the way I approach the Russian aircraft. Most of the Russian air-to-ground aircraft have some sort of multi-role capability, and I'm going to maintain the anti-radiation missiles on them because it gives you so much flexibility. On the US side, I'm actually going to recommend removing munitions from the platform when possible to minimize the point value. Again, going back to that trading assumption that the aircraft will probably get shot down. So how do I make sure that I get more destruction than the aircraft's cost? So the good example here, Su-34, it's very similar to the previous build, but what I've done is I've added took away the cluster bombs, and I added 4 of the KH-38s, which are very similar to the Maverick, right? Those are your air-to-ground munitions. Kept the anti-radiation missiles on, and kept 2 R-77s with ECM pods on. So a little bit of protection, defend itself against fighter aircraft, and then it's got 4 shots at tanks. If you come in and survive and kill 4 tanks, like 4 Abrams is 1,400 points right there. So even if you don't survive, that's a good trade. But if you're able to get away because you have these arms, you have the ECM pods, and you have the ability to fend off aircraft, that's huge. This is what makes the Su-34 such a valuable aircraft, because it can come in, handle all of those threats, and has the chance of making it home. Look at the jamming with the ECM pods, 20%. That's just nuts. On the A-10 side, this is a classic tank buster build. You'll notice that I left the cluster bombs off. Right, it's 6 Mavericks, it's 2 AIM-9s with an ECM pod. If you don't feel like having the AIM-9s, they're only 10 points, right? Which is why I chose them over the just the ECM pods alone. But having those sidewinders is nice if you run into helicopters. You can, and you can't swap them out for AMRAAMs with the A10. The 6 Mavericks plus the GAU 8, the BERT, that is going to absolutely shred an enemy vehicle column, especially if someone is spotting for you. If you see all the vehicles in one spot, you bring in the Thunderbolt low, you set in the strafing run, it'll pop up, it'll distribute the Mavericks beautifully, it'll do a gun run, and then the whole thing only costs 290 points, right? You could come in and you could say, hey, let's add some cluster bombs. Now it's 365, and now there's some additional micro required because these Rockeyes are high drag munitions, which means that you need to drop at low altitude. So either someone needs to be laser designating for all of your Mavericks, which is a little bit of a waste, or the aircraft may kind of perform in a funky way when you ask it to do a strafing run or a bombing run. You might have to turn off the Rockeyes to make your strafing run with the Mavericks and then hope you're still alive to work back around and drop the Rockeyes. If you only want your aircraft to use a specific weapon system, you can disable or enable the other weapon systems by clicking them down below. If you deselect a weapon, your aircraft won't use it until you turn it back on. This is different from hold fire, where your aircraft will return fire when it is fired upon. If you have the micro to make that work, then by all means build it out like this. Keep the aircraft on the field. You'll get more value for each sortie that you fly. But if you're like me and you're like, I'd rather just have it be cheaper, maybe keep it alive, knock out a bunch of tanks, and get it back onto the field 4 or 5 minutes later, this is the way that I would run it. 6 Mavericks, the GAU 8 Avenger, sidewinders with ECM pod. The last note here before we move on, you notice that I don't include designation pods when it's offered for additional points. This is because I firmly believe that the aircraft itself should not be it shouldn't be self-spotting. That means you're just going to put your aircraft in a rough position where it's trying to orbit and it is subject to anti-air fire. Every game that I've played in with high-level players, right, they have a lot of anti-air capability. There aren't significant gaps. So trying to have the aircraft designate for itself is usually a recipe for losing the aircraft. Okay, looking at 2 more air-to-ground builds, and they're going to be very similar to the previous ones. I really, really like this F-16 build, right? Fuel tanks for the inner pylons. This is just to minimize the cost, to be honest with you. It's the cheapest option there, and I don't want to mix, like I talked about previously, these dumb bombs with missiles. Middle pylons, 6 Mavericks, and then 2 AIM-120s, because again, I don't feel like I want to use this aircraft to counter helicopters, but this is the cheapest option, and it allows me to counter aircraft that are on the field. Then an ECM pod just to increase its chances of survival. So with 6 Mavericks, this aircraft can swoop in because it's much faster. It's a fighter, has good detection, can swoop in at low altitude, pop up, perform the Maverick gun run, knock out 6 tanks, and then get out before the enemy can trade it, which is why I like it in this configuration. On the Russian side, this is looking very similar. This is just available from the motorized infantry specialization, the Su-25T. So you've got 4 of these KH-25s, which function very much like Mavericks, and then KH-31s, the anti-radiation missiles, ECM pods. Again, keeping it simple, coming in, knocking out as many vehicles as possible in as short a time as possible. I also want to highlight here, you'll see these options for these Viker ATGMs, right? Good penetration, and there's 16 of them. But the issue with these is the 11 damage, right? So that basically means that even with huge penetration value, because you don't get top attack, right, over a tank, if you hit it in the front, you're going to need 2 shots to kill, and it's going to take, the aim time for these is still like 1 second per shot. So you need either a long gun run to make these effective, and makes the aircraft more expensive. So I would rather have the less expensive aircraft come in, get 4 straight kills on the tanks, and then get it out, than try to go for an extended gun run with these missiles. Now let's talk standoff support. On the Russian side, you've got this Tu-160 build with the 2 Fab 9000s. This is the budget nuke. Love this build for its effect. Run all the same risks as with the nuke, you're probably going to lose the plane, but if you find a troop concentration, this is brilliant. On the opposite side, the B-52, you got air-launched cruise missiles on the wings and in the bomb bay. There's a total of 20 missiles. Remember, this thing turns very, very slowly, has huge turn radius, but it's got a lot of fuel. It's got a little bit of extra health, and if you spot for it, you can keep one of these in the back. Certain maps where your airhead is really well protected, you can keep this all the way in the rear where it's not even seen by the enemy radar and aircraft, and just ripple off these missiles in a fire support role that's really, really hard to counter. It is 900 points, so you're not going to want to throw it away, but if you get all those missiles out, it'll absolutely be worth it. All right, and then in the kind of fire support role, there are two other kind of wonky builds, one that I've used and one that I've seen that I think can be really nasty. So first off, there's this F-117 Nighthawk with 2 JASMs. This thing, it's super cheap, and it's 2 cruise missiles, so they can get shot down, but if you need fire support, you can normally afford 2 of these in your actual deck build. You literally just call them in, use Precision Strike to take your 2 shots, send it back to base. You're on a 4-minute cooldown, you can call it in again. The JASMs themselves hit pretty hard. They're not going to kill tanks, but they're great for knocking out infantry in buildings or going after artillery or anti-air positions, as long as the missiles don't get intercepted. It's a great way to apply some pressure, especially if you time this with your teammates. On the opposite side, this little 4-post drone with Cornet ATGMs, it's kind of hilarious, but I was on the receiving end of an absolute beatdown. Our anti-air defenses were almost completely knocked out, and then we kept seeing just trains of these 4-post drones headed over the target, 4 or 5 at a time, and they just show up. They're so cheap. They're only 65 points. Shooting them down is barely worth anything, but if one of these kills one of your Abrams, I mean, that is huge. That is an unbelievable trade. So don't sleep on the drones with the ATGM capability. You can do this on the US side as well with like the MQ-1C or the MQ-9, but again, don't sleep on this. These drones are super cheap and can still do a lot of damage. Okay, now let's talk about keeping planes alive. Some of the builds don't really require you to put your jets in danger at all. Think about the B-52 with the cruise missiles, the F-22 or the Su-57 operating at max range. It just requires a little bit of micro. And here's the way I want you to think about this. Again, it comes back to trading, but if you're going to bring a plane onto the field, it's only there for a short period of time, and it's there to do a very specific task. So get it in, pay attention to it, get it to accomplish what you set out to, and then get it back and take care of it. That's the best way. Like, you almost want to babysit your planes. You don't want to bring them on, forget about them, and let them get shot down. That's a really easy way to feed your opponents a lot of destruction points. If you do need to have a plane come on the field early in expectation of a target, keep it at the back, put it at low altitude so it's harder to see, and make sure you use terrain masking where you can. In built-up areas, the high rises can actually keep some of the more exquisite anti-air systems from being able to see, so you can use those to prevent getting shot down at range by anti-air. Or you can also think about bringing airplanes in waves, either on your own or with your teammates, so you have some suppression of enemy air defenses before the rest of your aircraft arrive. We talked about ECM during the build phase, and that's just kind of a flat defensive buff to your aircraft. But what I want to talk about now are evasive maneuvers. And this is almost like an instant reaction or a battle drill, something that you do as soon as you see that your airplane is being shot at, or as a precaution, if you're doing like a ground attack, your airplane pops up to execute its attack. What do you do after that? First thing is you want to turn away from the enemy. Ideally, you're conducting your gun runs kind of parallel to the line or to the front, rather than really overextending. If you go perpendicular to the line of action, what will happen a lot of times is you might get some good hits in, but then your airplane is literally flying into the strongest part of the enemy's anti-air defenses. So that's not necessarily a good idea. Either way, evasive maneuvers, turn away, activate decoys. If you came up to high altitude, get back down to low altitude, and consider hitting the Afterburner. Afterburner is risk reward a little bit. In general, I like using it. It does double your fuel consumption, and it does significantly increase your turn radius. So if you're in a dogfight or you're dodging a specific missile, using Afterburner can actually make you easier to hit. But in general, when you're trying to evade, if you see a missile, you want to either turn towards it or turn perpendicular to it. What you don't want to do is necessarily present the rear of the airplane to the missile's path in a straight line. And then if you need to do that, you definitely want to be on Afterburn to try to run away from it. But at this point, the evasive maneuver essentially is like turn away from all the threats, get low, get fast, and then as soon as you clear the immediate area, use terrain masking and start charting your route back to the plane spawn point. Then you hit the back to base button and get the refund for the aircraft. This is a good example of a seed run followed by immediate action to evade counterfire. The reason that the Su-34 doesn't fire on the Patriots is because their radar is not yet on, but then the radar activates while the Su-34 is on exfil, and you see how I use low altitude afterburner and decoys to make sure that the Su-34 escapes the Patriot missiles. One final thing to note about altitude and afterburner. These take effect whenever you put them, and they don't interrupt other movement commands. So it's kind of cool because you can keep your plane on its planned path, tell it to elevate or tell it to go down in altitude, tell it to go faster or slower. However, what you cannot do is shift queue up altitude and afterburner orders. So you can't just queue the entire flight path and include, descending in altitude and hitting afterburner as soon as you drop the bombs. If you hit those keys, even with shift activated, your plane will react immediately. So something to keep in mind. Those are independent from the other movement cues. The next thing I want to talk about is essentially the sequence for using aircraft in this game, right? Because you don't want to bring them in and have them loitering. What you really want to do is, again, identify a role or a task for an aircraft to accomplish. Hopefully it's a task that you actually have an aircraft designed to execute. So whether it's you've identified an armored push and you have an air-to-ground aircraft that you want to bring in to smash that, you have identified an enemy radar that you need to annihilate, or the enemy is pushing their own aircraft and attacking your ground forces and you need to execute an anti-air mission. Either way, you identify the mission, you call in the appropriate aircraft, you immediately, when you call it in, put it in a spot where it's not just flying into the center of the battlefield. I normally pick one side or the other and have it enter so it's entering the battlefield at kind of an oblique angle to the front or to the threat. From there, I almost always put the airplane at low altitude immediately, and then I start to route the aircraft using terrain masking as much as possible at low altitude towards the area where I need it to make contact with the enemy. Sometimes, like we talked about with anti-air missions or air superiority missions, you're just going to have it kind of orbit along your back line. Same thing with a bomber that's launching cruise missiles, etc. But for an air-ground aircraft or a seed aircraft, you're going to want to bring it in kind of on the side and set up its gun run or its missile run parallel to the front where you're in contact with the enemy. That's going to give you the best opportunity to exfil. Once it's set up and you have everything spotted, right, and you know what your targets are, this point you're going to execute the actual engagement. And depending on what you're doing, this might require quite a bit of micro, right? So if you have high drag bombs and then you want to pop up to fire missiles, or you're going to pop up to execute kind of a free fall bomb run, smart munition run, etc. That's what you want to spend a lot of your time, energy, and focus on setting up, because that has to trade out. Again, assume that you're going to lose the aircraft. So if you're going to lose a 400-point ground attack aircraft, make sure you get at least 400 points of kills out of it before it goes down. Then you kind of just want to have a plan for your exfil. Which way are you going to ask the aircraft to turn after it drops its payload? Bring it back to low altitude, have it turn, hit decoys, hit the afterburner. If you see missiles streaking after you, continue to spam the decoy button. Your aircraft has 15 to 20 sets of decoys. They don't really cost anything in terms of supply, so it is absolutely worth spamming them to make sure that you break contact. Once you're over friendly lines and there are no more missiles chasing you, hit the back to base button. Good to go. Now at this point, you're probably like, okay, Shark, that's cool, but I only have 3 aircraft. If I try to bring them all in the field at the same time, that's like 1,200 points, and the enemy's got a bunch of S-300s, they got a bunch of Tunguskas, and I don't really know how I can solve this all by myself. That is a fact. You can't solve it all by yourself. That's why you have teammates. So in this case, if you've got coordination, ideally you're on voice comms, you want to set up kind of a team approach to this. Say, hey, I've identified this armor column on the left. Does anyone have seed aircraft that can support my push? Does anyone have anti-air, right? Take the 15 to 20 seconds on voice comms. Vehicles don't move that fast in Broken Arrow, so you normally have time to set something up. If you gotta wait a minute for your teammate to have another aircraft available, then do so. That's actually really important. If you need recon to identify the target, start working that now. Whether it's a drone, whether it's moving one of your sniper teams, make sure you can actually identify and see the target and break down the problem. Then coordinate, first off, who is going to go in and manage the seed problem, right? If they have those big high-end anti-air missiles, you're going to want to deal with them first, or at least put pressure on them. Some of them, like the S-300 Anti, are really capable, but there's only 2 missiles per launcher. So if they waste their missiles knocking harms out of the sky, they have to reload before they can fire at your jets. Next, make sure somebody has an anti-air platform, at least in the rear. Ideally, it's one of the exquisite ones, like an F-22 or an Su-57, that can sit in the back and just lob anti-air missiles at anyone coming in to threaten your air-to-ground targets. And then at that point, you bring in your tank busters, you execute what you're looking for, or you bring in your bomber, you drop bombs on that enemy troop concentration, everybody high fives and goes home. And if you've done it right, you'll get all your planes out too, you get all those points back, and you've just inflicted a huge amount of damage on the enemy at very little cost to your own team. So well done. A little bit of coordination goes a long way. Recovering down pilots and returning them to base also significantly shortens the cooldown of your aircraft's availability. Okay, a couple of reminders to close out. A lot of Broken Arrow is about trading, right? So again, know your deck, know the roles of your planes, and then know what looks like a successful mission. A 290-point A-10 coming in and smoking 3 T-90s is a great trade. An F-35 flying over the middle of the map and getting knocked down by an S-300 before it accomplishes anything is a terrible trade, right? Ideally, you're at least getting 1-to-1, but think about the opportunity cost of however many points you're putting on the battlefield and the 10-minute cooldown that's required when a plane is destroyed. So really, you should be aiming to get double the return on investment for your aircraft to make it worthwhile to bring aircraft onto the battlefield. If you aim for that 2-to-1, I think you'll generally be successful. The other thing that I'll recommend is if you're relatively new to using aircraft in Broken Arrow, I would stay away from the really micro-intensive aircraft. Instead, I'd focus on single-use, single-role platforms and just really getting accustomed to, one, executing those very specific roles well, which is probably going to be more of a support fashion for your team. And then 2, really focusing on the micro required to get the planes back alive. If you have a couple of games where you're actually using aircraft, you're inflicting damage on the enemy, and then you're getting the plane back every time, then you're really starting to achieve success. You're going to make a difference for your team. And then you can start getting more aggressive with some of the multi-role approaches or some of the more complicated bombing setups that require laser designation or complex micro, low altitude, high altitude combinations, etc. So start with kind of small goals. Go like get an air superiority fighter, get a seed fighter, get a single kind of fire support, whether it's like a Nighthawk or a Tu-160, something that's just going to launch cruise missiles from the back, so that you can kind of practice and learn the mechanics in game. And then once you start to trade out, everything will get easier. All right, that is all I got. If you were able to watch this, I had a bunch of different kind of demonstrations rolling on the screen in the background. If not, I will publish more, especially in some of the gameplay footage. You can see how I'm able to use the aircraft, achieve the success, and kind of keep them alive and roll on to the next thing. So the question for you guys now is, what did I miss? What else do you need to see? Whether it's air related or other tutorials for this game, let me know in the comment section down below. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch y'all in the next one.